In the early morning light of December 7th, 1941, the Pacific was calm. On the waters north of Hawaii, a fleet moved silently. 6 carriers, hundreds of aircraft, thousands of men bound by duty and conviction. For Japan, it was not merely an attack. It was a decision born from desperation, pride, and a belief that survival itself was at stake. The world would remember that day as the strike on Pearl Harbor. But to understand why, we must go back, to the years when the rising sun felt cornered by the shadows of the great powers.
Japan had emerged from the First World War as an ambitious empire. Its industry was growing, its military confident, its people united under the banner of the emperor. But behind this confidence lay unease. A nation small in land, poor in resources, yet rich in ambition. The world beyond Japan's islands controlled the very things it needed to survive: oil, rubber, iron, and trade. When the Great Depression swept across the globe, Japan suffered deeply. Factories closed, rice prices collapsed, and people starved. To many, the solution lay not in retreat but in expansion, to secure what the islands could not provide. In 1931, Japan's Kwantung Army seized Manchuria, claiming it as a new realm of prosperity, Manchukuo. The League of Nations condemned the act. Japan walked out in defiance. It was the beginning of isolation, the first crack between Japan and the Western world. By 1937, war with China erupted in full. Japan's soldiers marched under banners of destiny, believing they were bringing order to Asia. But the war dragged on, consuming resources and lives. Behind the victories, a question haunted the generals. How long could Japan fight without fuel? The United States, Britain, and the Netherlands watched uneasily. They saw an empire growing bolder, one that sought to dominate Asia's coasts and seas. To Japan, however, it was a matter of survival, a fortress nation surrounded by Western empires. Then came the blow that sealed Japan's fate. In July 1941, after Japan occupied French Indochina, the United States froze all Japanese assets and imposed a full oil embargo. 80% of Japan's oil came from America. Without it, the ships would stop, the planes would ground, and the nation would kneel within months. For many in Tokyo, surrender was unthinkable. Japan had fought to become the equal of the West, not its subject. Negotiations followed, but hope faded quickly. Each demand from Washington seemed to strike at Japan's pride and sovereignty. Imperial Conference Room, Tokyo, late 1941. In that room, the leaders of Japan faced a terrible choice: to yield and risk humiliation, or to strike and risk destruction. Admiral Yamamoto, who had studied in America and admired its strength, warned his peers, "If we must fight, I can run wild for 6 months, maybe a year, but after that I can promise nothing." He knew the odds. Yet even he bowed to the will of the empire. The die was cast. Japan would gamble everything, its honor, its future, and the lives of millions on a single, blinding strike. At dawn on November 26, 1941, Japan's carrier fleet sailed from Hitokapu Bay. Their course was secrecy. Their destination, Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. They moved under radio silence, across the endless blue, guided only by faith and calculation. To the men aboard, this was not a mission of cruelty. It was duty. To cripple the U.S. Pacific Fleet, to buy Japan 6 months of freedom to secure its Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere. They told themselves it was not aggression, but preemption, a desperate act before the walls closed in. At December 7, 1941, 6 a.m., north of Oahu, the pilots rose from their hammocks in the chill dawn. They tied their headbands, hachimaki, symbols of courage and death. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida led the first wave, his voice calm yet resolute. At 7:55 a.m., Fuchida gave the signal, "Tora! Tora! Tora!" The sky over Pearl Harbor erupted in fire and thunder. Battleships turned into infernos. Smoke covered the Pacific sun. By the time the planes returned to their carriers, The pride of the U.S. Pacific Fleet lay in ruins. For Japan, it was victory beyond imagination. Admiral Yamamoto, upon hearing of the success, stood silent. He murmured the words history would remember. I fear all we have done is to awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve. In Tokyo, hours later. Crowds cheered. Newspapers shouted triumph. For a brief moment, Japan believed it had seized its destiny. But behind the celebration, the seeds of tragedy had already taken root. In the months that followed, Japan's empire expanded like a tide. Hong Kong, Singapore, the Philippines, Indonesia, one after another, they fell. For a time, Yamamoto's prophecy held true. Japan ran wild, but the tide began to turn. At Midway, June 1942, 4 Japanese carriers were sunk. The empire's momentum shattered in a single battle. From then on, Japan's war became one of defense, island by island, retreat by retreat. Tokyo, 1944. The skies that once carried Japan's hope now carried death. American bombers roared overhead, cities burned to ash, resources dwindled. Starvation crept across the islands, yet the government refused to surrender. To die for the emperor was seen as honor, to live in defeat, shame. In the Pacific jungles, Japanese soldiers fought to the last man. On the seas, kamikaze pilots turned their bodies into weapons. They did not fight for conquest anymore. They fought so their homeland might live one day longer. Hiroshima, August 6, 1945. At 8:15 a.m., a new kind of sun rose above Hiroshima, silent for a moment, then louder than the earth itself. The atomic bomb erased a city in seconds. 3 days later, Nagasaki followed. Even for a nation hardened by years of war, the horror was beyond comprehension. Emperor Hirohito's voice, for the first time, reached his people by radio. He told them to endure the unendurable. Japan laid down its arms. The war was over. The empire that sought to stand equal among the great powers lay in ashes, its cities burned, its people hungry, its pride broken. But from those ashes, a new Japan slowly emerged. One that turned its strength not to conquest, but to creation. Factories rebuilt, schools reopened. Democracy took root. In the years that followed, Japan's soldiers became workers, its generals became teachers, and its weapons became tools. The lessons of Pearl Harbor, the weight of ambition, the cost of pride, became the foundations of a peace Japan swore never to break again. More than 80 years have passed since that morning in 1941. The rusted hulls still rest beneath the waters of Pearl Harbor, silent witnesses to a day that changed the world. Each December, the sun rises over Oahu, and its light touches both the stars and stripes and the memory of the rising sun. The story of Pearl Harbor is not one of villains and heroes, but of nations blinded by fear and pride. Japan believed it was fighting for survival. America fought to defend its peace. In the end, both paid a price that reshaped the century. From the ashes of war, Japan found its true strength, not in the roar of engines, but in the silence of reflection. Not in conquest, but in creation. Not in the rising of a sun, but in its calm, enduring light. Thanks for watching, and if you'd like more fascinating chapters of history, hit that subscribe button.